one of the best tests to see how well your mud will do in a mudding project is the snake test. Hello fellow mudders! Do you want to start a mud project but are not quite sure where to start? Allow me to help you while I start my new project. Depending on where you live, you're going to have a different silt, sand, and clay content. And depending on those ratios, you may need to bring in material, like clay or lime, to ensure you end up with a good hard mud that'll work for your project. But that can be pretty expensive, so before you go that route, really try and work with the dirt that you have available. And with the mud project that I have going, I want to make sure I end up with a good hard mud. I'm going to be building an outdoor rocket stove to be able to cook outdoors. But first, I need to clean up and kind of get this little spot ready so I can start digging. And all the dirt that I get out of this spot, I will use that to make mud to build the rocket stove. So the question is, how well will this dirt work for my mud project? Let me show you the 3 different ways I'll test some dirt to see if it makes for a good mud. Test 1. So the first thing I'm going to do is sift out some dirt. So now that I have my dirt sifted, I'm going to start off with the jar test. I'm going to fill it about halfway up with dirt and then add water to fill the rest of the jar. Put the lid on and shake it really well. So now we have all the dirt particles suspended in water. And now I'm going to set it aside to give time for all the particles of dirt to settle out of the water. And that's going to give me a rough idea of how much sand, silt, and clay is in this dirt. And of course, the next test is to actually make some mud. I want to mix this mud to be really thick and peanut buttery. Test 2. I think one of the best tests to see how well your mud will do in a mudding project is the snake test. You take a little mud, you turn it into a little snake, and you bend it into a circle. And depending on how well it holds its integrity in the little circle, will show you that it's going to make or maybe not make a decent mud for projects. And I got a little bit of cracking, so I know that this is a pretty sandy mixture. But otherwise, working the mud a little bit, it holds its integrity pretty nicely. So it does tell me that it does have a decent clay content and silt content, but is a little bit sandy, but will make a good mud to build with. Snake test, passed. Test 3. I'm just going to take this funny little TV dinner thing and create a brick out of this mud. I'm going to make sure that I'm really squishing the mud into this mold to make sure there's no air pockets. And then I'll use a little water to smooth out the top so I can see how the smooth mud surface dries. And now I'll make the puck. I like to make it between 1/2 and 1 inch thick and somewhere around as big as my palm. The next couple days, while these dry, I'm going to sift all the dirt that came from the hole. All the rocks and gravel are going to create a layer in this hole, so I have a nice base to start with. This base is going to essentially be the insulative bottom between where the fire will be and the ground. For one, trying to keep all the heat within the stove area, but also is not to burn the ground, essentially, just in case there's any roots or anything else under there that could possibly catch fire if the base of the fire were to get hot enough. So I need to add a little bit more still, of course, but I always like to do a nice insulative layer underneath any sort of fire pit I am building. So it's the next day, and this is our jar test. We can see all the material has settled out of the water. So we can see there is a little bit of organic material because I've been digging out from under the tree. But you can see a definite line between the sand and all the silt and clay. Now the snake test did tell us that it was a pretty sandy mixture, and we can see that maybe 2/3, a little bit less than that, is more of a sandy material. And the rest is the silt, and it's hard to see this line here, but there is our clay. I definitely like mixtures with a lot more clay in it, but the silt for me has proven to be a pretty decent replacement for clay. It's still a very fine particle and does make a good mud. It's more the sandiness that usually makes the issue. And this test, unlike the snake test, gives us more of a view of what percentage is sand and what percentage is our clay and silt. So this test can be really helpful to get a rough estimate of what's in your dirt. And since this jar isn't mostly filled up with sand, jar test passed. Now we have the brick and the puck. They're both drying very nicely, very minimal cracking. The smooth surface is staying pretty smooth on the brick, and we can see that there is some shrinking in the container, which of course is expected as the material dries and the water leaves the dirt, leaving space. But even through this shrinking, very minimal cracking, so it's looking pretty good so far through the drying process. And the same thing goes with the puck. It's looking pretty nice and it's drying pretty darn well. A little bit better than the brick since it's in plastic, but it's drying very well, no cracking, and is already a pretty solid little hunk of mud. So far, as this is drying, is still showing me that this is a pretty decent mud. And in a day or two, we'll do some stress testing and see how hard of a mud this is. I'm also gonna take this brick out of the mold so it dries a little faster. But look at that pretty brick.
Also, I just noticed I have a pretty little kitty paw in my little brick. I didn't notice until the light hit it in the last clip. Silly cats.
So far with the brick and puck test, passing. And now back to the pit where I needed to add some more gravel. I went for some smaller gravel to fill in all the spaces, as well as to rake it really well in order to make it all even. 2 days later, these seem pretty dry. It's now time to stress test them. Say that 3 times fast. But also we'll be looking at cracking, crumbliness, and the way the surfaces have dried. So the puck looks pretty darn good. Pretty smooth. No actual cracking from the drying process. It's just kind of textured because of the way I made it. I didn't make it entirely smooth, but it looks pretty good. Sounds pretty good, nice and dry. I'll do a scratch test. Just kind of scratch the surface with my nail to see if it's gonna kind of crumble that way. And it's really not crumbling, making sort of little marks, but not even. And only a little bit of dirt under my nail. So it's pretty hard surface-wise in that manner. And even if I try to rub some of the surface, no crumbling, pretty solid, little dusty. Now it's time to stress test it. Essentially, I'm just gonna break it in half with my hands and kind of decide how hard I think the mud is. Not too bad. When it broke, it didn't crumble a whole lot. I had a little bit, which is normal, but it didn't fall apart. The edges where it cracked, a little flaky, not terribly, kind of comes off how I'd expect it to, but not in a very crumbly way. So that's very good. We smack them together, let's see what happens. Ooh, that piece crumbled off a little bit, but I'd already stressed it, so it makes sense. But again, it's not super crumbly, even if I'm kind of crushing them together. Kind of just keep breaking it into smaller pieces. You can also step on it, crush it with a rock, just any way to see how hard and what stress this mud can take. And the brick test is essentially the same, it's just a bigger chunk of mud. But something we are gonna look at that's different to the puck, we're gonna put the brick back in its form and make note of the shrinkage. Any shrinkage is going to be normal, but it's a good idea to always at least have kind of a knowledge of how much it's gonna shrink, due to the fact that the more that it shrinks within a mold, you'll have a higher likelihood of it cracking when used in a project. When mud dries in a form like this, or even as the puck, it's gonna shrink into itself, which does help minimize cracking. But when you use it in a project, it's mudded between things, around things, on top of things, and if it's a bigger chunk of mud, it might adhere better to other areas of mud, to drier areas of mud, or maybe to the form of your mud project. So if you start off with a wire form to mud, that mud might stick better to the wire than to other areas of the mud and cause more cracking, if that all makes sense. The way mud shrinks is important when it comes to cracking. The more this shrinks, the more likely you'll have more cracking. There's always some cracking, but you want to minimize it as much as you can. So with that said, this doesn't have a ton of shrinking, but a little bit of shrinking to note. The surface is very smooth. I do have maybe some cracks during the drying process right here, but that makes sense because there's kind of this imperfection here and the cracks kind of worked up from there. So I'm guessing that when I do the break test, it's probably going to break right along in there. Let's see how much it takes to break this bigger brick. A lot more, actually. There we go. So I wasn't really able to kind of bend it with my hand to make it break. I needed a little leverage. But again, it didn't kind of like crumble when it broke. I don't think I really heard any crumbles. It's maybe a little wet in the middle, but otherwise it's pretty dry. But not so much crumbling on the edges, just like the puck. Let's see how solid. Definitely the thicker chunk of mud is a lot harder, which again makes sense. But I think this is going to be a pretty decent mud. Very nice indeed. The puck and the brick test definitely passed. So the dirt that I sifted will make for a good mud. Though we do know it is a little bit sandy. So I do have the option to find some more material that has more clay in it. And I can find out if it has more clay by repeating all these little tests. There's also the option to separate the clay and the silt from the sand by redoing the jar test in like a big 5-gallon bucket. Mix up a bunch of dirt and water, allow the sand to settle out of the water, and then pour off that murky water that still has the silt and the clay in it. Then the silt and clay will settle out of the water, and I can pour off that water and I'll be left with the silty clay material. Then I can add it into the mud mixtures to give it a higher clay content. But I also do have a spot that has good clay content, so I could go get some of that clay. But it's not exactly necessary, because this is some pretty good mud. So this dirt has passed the jar test, the snake test, and the puck and brick test. It has shown that it's not necessary to add anything extra into this dirt to create a good hard mud. I do have the benefit that we naturally have a high lime content in our dirt. So that really does help the hardness with the mud that I get from almost any dirt on this property. But that is an option to add into mud mixtures is lime to create a harder mud, as well as I have the option to add more clay into it. But this dirt has really proven itself through all 3 tests. With my experiences, I don't think I need to add anything extra into this dirt to make it a successful mud for my project. But it is true because this project is going to be outside in the weather. It is going to need upkeep. So in the future, I may need to fix some cracking, breaking, and just wear and tear. I really feel that testing out the dirt that you have can really help benefit the wallet. Because if you know what's in your dirt, you can work with that dirt to create a really good mud without having to bring in too many extra materials, like maybe lime or extra clay. But it is true, if you have way more sand than you do maybe clay or silt, getting resources from outside areas may be something you have to think about. But also check other areas. See if you have a nice pocket of clay that you can add into that sand to maybe create some good hard mud. But I'm super excited for this project. I've started bending some forms out of scrap wire and fencing so that I can mix a big batch of mud and really get this mud party started. Stay tuned. Happy mudding! Peace!